It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. On Wednesday, Venezuela's National Electoral Council announced that the next presidential elections will be held on April 22nd. International mediators and government representatives had hoped that the opposition negotiators would sign an agreement that the two sides had worked out over the past several months. However, despite pressure from Spain's former Prime Minister Zapatero, opposition negotiators have so far not signed the agreement nor committed to participating in the next presidential election. Earlier this week, I spoke to the Venezuelan embassy's charge d'affaires in Washington, D.C., Carlos Ron, who joined me in our Baltimore studios. One of the topics we talked about was the upcoming presidential election in Venezuela. And for full disclosure, I must say once again that Carlos and I used to work for President Chavez at Miraflores in Caracas. So thank you.
My pleasure to be here.
Carlos, one very big issue that is outstanding at this point is the issue of whether the opposition will participate in the upcoming election. And give us a sense of what the issues are about the opposition participating in the elections.
Well, what we've seen, our perception is that there's sectors of the opposition that they're not interested in participating. Last year we had 3 electoral processes, for the Constituent Assembly, for the governors, and then for municipal elections, and the results were kind of surprising for them, in the sense that they realized that they lost a lot of support in some of these elections. And we think that, it was really the result of people upset at their leadership, the opposition leadership, because for half of last year, it took them towards a violent, all these violent protests where they tried to, create chaos in the country. And at the end of the day, their own base was also angry at this strategy, and it showed by them not supporting some of these political parties. So I think that now they face the challenge of not having support because their own base is upset about the violence, and the possibility of not having enough support to win a presidential challenge.
Now, some people in the opposition are saying the election has been advanced. Normally it would be taking place late in the year. And it has been advanced because it is in the benefit of the ruling party. Because of oil prices are up, it's doing better than it did in the past in terms of the economy. And well, of course, the opposition is in disarray and doesn't have a clear leader chosen to run against the ruling party of Maduro. So these are mechanisms or tactics to manipulate the upcoming election. Would you agree with that?
No, I think, even if we go over the issue of the oil prices, for you to actually feel the result of higher prices, you need to let a few months go down the road, because the payments are done over a set period of time. So it's not something immediate. So that argument, I think, falls apart. The other issue that there might be some truth in what you said, that they are in disarray. They really don't have a united front because they don't really know what to do. Some of them have opted, there's groups of opposition leaders that are here in the United States that have, claimed that there's no need to go to elections. There's no way, the only way to get rid of President Maduro will be towards a coup or something violent to that effect. But they're not really committed to participating in the democratic process. Look, at the end of the day, last year, for the last 2 years even, what they've been, the one thing that they've always been calling for is presidential elections. They wanted those elections to be held earlier. They wanted those elections to be held immediately at some point in time. And it's surprising that now that they see that their perspectives of winning are so gloomy, now they decided that they don't want to participate, or part of them decided they don't want to participate. it is important, though, to know that part of the opposition is taking, it's signing up. It has presented candidates already. Acción Democrática, who has been almost, you could say, the antagonist party to Chavismo, before President Chavez was elected, is participating and is presenting a candidate. Dissidents from Chavismo have presented a candidate, which is, for example, Henry Falcón is also aspiring to be a presidential candidate. So there is an opposition that wants to go to elections. There's just a group that, took the violence, the violence strategy last year. That's the one that's trying to pull off.
What about the candidates who have been barred from participating in the process? Well,
there's different reasons for some of these people to to not be in the process. And again, there's usually politicians that have somehow being accused of or have trials. For example, Leopoldo Lopez is one of the who has a conviction. He might not be able to participate, and others to that effect. People that have that are being charged with corruption. Other countries do the same thing. I mean, there's always rules about who is able to participate, especially if they have accusations of corruption during some of their tenures. But again, these people that said are barred, not necessarily running candidates. I mean, there are people that are politicians in Venezuela and not necessarily the ones running for this election in particular. Others are able to run. So there's a whole array of opposition leaders who can, very well come out and dispute the elections.
Now, Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, has already stated that they would not recognize this election even before the election had taken place, or whether he knew who the candidates were. What is the purpose in doing that? And I know this is perhaps a question to the U.S. government, but they are going around Latin America trying to get more countries to not recognize this presidential election. As far as you know, why is this taking place, and is Tillerson successful in mustering support for their position?
Look, I think it's important to point out that this is very troublesome for Venezuelans because, first of all, it's a violation of international law. I mean, just the rights of self-determination is violated when you have another government basically say that whatever you do, whatever the result of your elections are, we're not going to recognize them. It's already infringing upon Venezuela's rights. But also, it does reveal that the intention seems to be regime change in Venezuela, whatever the costs are. I mean, during his, like you said, during his trip to, right before he left the United States, actually, he gave a speech in Austin, where he said, in a way that reminded us a lot about President Bush, when he said, either you're with us or you're with the terrorists. Secretary Tillerson says, either you're with democracies and the United States, or you're with Maduro. And, it's sort of putting Venezuela into that perspective. It sort of points at what has happened to other countries in the same way as, what happened in Libya, what happened in Syria, what happened in Iraq. It seems like there's a willingness to, to exert some sort of regime change in Venezuela and not to recognize any of our institutions.
Well, President Maduro could choose to just leave. I mean, that'd be the easiest. We have not advocated for regime change or removal of President Maduro. Rather, we have advocated that they return to the Constitution. We do not recognize the Constituent Assembly as legitimate. I think there will be a change. We want it to be a peaceful change. In the history of Venezuela, and in fact the history in other Latin American, South American countries, oftentimes it's the military that handles that. That when things are so bad that the military leadership realizes they can't serve the citizens anymore, they will manage a peaceful transition. Whether that will be the case here or not, I do not know. If he is not reelected by the people, so be it. And if the kitchen gets a little too hot for him, I'm sure that he's got some friends over in Cuba that can give him a nice hacienda on the beach, and he can have a nice life over there.
All right, Carlos, tell us what this moment was about and what does it resonate in terms of the history of Venezuela and Latin American relations?
Well, it's very telling, that there is an option under consideration that has to do with regime change when you basically do an open invitation for anybody in the Venezuelan military to take an action as has been taken before in Latin America and overthrow the government. And, we have a horrible history in our continent, in Chile, Guatemala, and Brazil, Uruguay, all these coups. And even more recently, what happened in Brazil, in Honduras, and in Paraguay, ways that people in the military have affected democracy and tried to overthrow the government. At the end of the day, it just seems that there is an intent of not recognizing, of not letting the people of Venezuela choose. If there was to be any electoral process, they wouldn't let the Venezuelan people vote for President Maduro or for Chavismo to continue because they already set their minds that that's not what they want.
Carlos, there's a lot of hype in the Western media about how the government of President Maduro is not going to allow certain opposition candidates to participate in this election, therefore seriously impeding democratic process from taking place. Is that so, and what is your take on it?
Well, like I said before, there are very important parties from the opposition, very representative, very numerous in their base, who have already been, presenting candidates, and they're taking part of the process. However, there's a few groups that were somehow tied to the violence of last year, and their tragedy is not that the president or the government's not letting them participate, but actually their base is not backing them up in order to do that. Under Venezuelan electoral law, a party that has not participated in a national process needs to revalidate its membership because it skipped the process, basically. And that was being asked, for example, of Primera Justicia. The tragedy for Primera Justicia is that they went out and asked people for, to validate their membership, to come out and vote for them and sign that they were members of the party. And they didn't gather enough signatures to do that. And you could tell, you could see why, because, once you've offered before violence as your strategy, and then you want your base to come back and try elections, there's a trauma there, but their own base. So it's something in their own fault. And by the way, that's not something that happens only in Venezuela. I mean, the revalidation of parties is something that even here in the United States, if you go to the FEC, you see that, parties that don't have the sufficient votes and certain elections to sustain their status as a qualified party are also required sometimes to come out and gather a signature of membership. So this is part of a normal process that takes place in any democracy. And the problem is not that the government's not letting them participate. The problem is that their base is not convinced that they want to support them to participate.
Carlos, many analysts are saying the current situation in Venezuela is at such a crisis point in terms of inflation, in terms of goods and services, people being able to just live. It's so difficult that if the opposition would participate in this election, they would actually win. Give us a sense of why the exchange rates in Venezuela, there are many, are so complicated, and why there's such a vibrant black market, which is creating such a crisis and havoc in the country.
So there's several factors, and it's sort of complicated to put it in a brief period of time, but let me tell you. First thing, the exchange rate is being simplified, and so that was one of the measures that was taken last week in order to sort of ease that problem. But this is a historical measure that has taken place in order to prevent capital flight. I mean, we know that most of countries in Latin America that have had progressive leadership at some point have faced the threat of capital flight, and that was the reason that this had to be implemented in the first place. Then some people found a way also to make profit of the exchange rate, and you have even a website like Dollar Today, which is run from outside of the country, inducing inflation by presenting an altered exchange rate that it has no basis in actual economic transactions, but just on it's a way of sabotaging the economy. So, some of those issues is part of the war, the economic war that we've been facing, and trying to get rid of it. At the end of the day, I think it's important to realize that the Venezuelan people have been resisting this stoically, and that even then. Last year, when we had 3 electoral processes, from July on, there was a lot of conviction from many Venezuelans who came out and supported decisively, President Maduro and President Maduro's party, and that shows, that people understand that we're all Venezuelans being victims of this economic war, and that there's the need to support the government to be able to move forward and find other solutions.
All right, Carlos, I thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And we'll be following this upcoming election, and we hope you join us again here.
Sure. Thank you.
And thank you for joining us here on the Real News Network.